Let's get caption. Share. Okay. Okay, so they mirror the back screen to this now, but not the HDMI one. Okay. I put in multiple service ticket to get things to work. All right, we are gonna talk about email forensic today. You are gonna do a lab using bulk extractor, and as I mentioned in the last unit, bulk extractor is one of my favorite tools. It is Windows friendly, so you will be able to see like the email content that is from the image. And we're going to use a case that was talked about in the textbook. So you will see a little bit more. But a lot of the times we can retrieve email information from the actual device or the system. Some of it could be your mobile phone. Some of it could be your laptop or your Windows systems. And then you would use the logs from your service provider to verify. So some of it you can do and pull some data, but you need to also verify it. So for example, if it's a Gmail account, you will probably need to have court order to request the Google to be able to provide you with some additional information. So it talks about RFC, and when you use bulk extractor today, you will see a folder in the report that would provide some RFC information, and it stands for request for comment. When you use protocol or technology, you would see that RFC is it's going to provide you some information about that particular technology. So they are independent researcher, and that allows us to be able to have updated information regarding specification and communication protocol. So when you're using email, likely that you're going to use SMTP. This is used for a mail server, right? Like Outlook, or other type of server that would have mail transmission. So what you see is for SMTP, it uses port 25, and you would see the RFC number, right? It would have some updated number and also some other versions, so you would refer to the RFC number. So in the case that you want to find more information about technology or protocol or service communication, you can refer to the RFC document to be able to read more about it. Okay, so let's go through, right? For number one, it says, when can digital investigator locate evidence relating to an email investigation? The machine will have the destination version of the email. That means that if you are the recipient of the email, your computer would have that version of the email. You can also obtain the same email through the server, because that's the system that would transfer your email, right, from the time that it's sent to the time that it's received. Now, as you know that it will go through multiple servers, especially if you're using web-based mail like Gmail, Yahoo, live.com, right? Some of those are older. And when you use bulk extractor today, you would see that there might be something very old in there, like from AOL days, because the image captures something that was dated. So the device that used to access the email, it would have the information about the email, right? And so when we pull the email, normally we refer to the email header. Sometimes it's able to retrieve like subject line or even the content of the email it was downloaded. And so your mobile phone, your mobile devices, your computer, and then we can also go to the service provider, like what we said, right? So if you're using Apple system, right, and the service provider would only grant you access to someone else's email information if you have legal orders or court order to be able to do that. Now, we mentioned that SMTP stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. This is used for something like Exchange Server, which is Microsoft Mail Server. But if you're using other type of server, right, like sometime it could be a Linux system, it still use Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. But in this case, if you're using SMTP, you are using port 25. That's a common port for the server. So at the server end, you would see that it's using port 25 to be able to circulate the mail. So the job of the server is to make sure that the mail gets to your inbox, right? And then anything that you draft or saved, or flagged or downloaded, right? It needs to be on there because it is a way that we can store the same mailbox information, right? Or content of your email onto another system. So that system will be able to transfer that information to your local computer. Now, if you're using, like, let's say a web-based mail that you would access over the internet, the protocol that you see for email mailbox on the client system, that will be POP3, which stands for Post Office Protocol. This is the version 3, and it uses port 110. The reason why we focus on these is because when you are looking at email headers, you are going to see the protocol information, the services, right, that is tied to the protocol. You're going to see email servers. You will see many email servers in between from the time that the email was sent to the time that was received. So these are the servers that transfer the mail to the destination. And on the client system, if they are using a specific type of email, they would need to access it via this port value, right? And this is going to be for POP3. Now, you would see a lot of people get confused between IMAP and POP3, and I think I covered this in another class as well. But the POP3 or POP really retrieves the content from the mailbox, right? Like when you click your inbox, you would see like how many mail you have, or even if you have outgoing mail. So it has the subdirectory inside your actual email box. IMAP is really a way that we can remotely access the mailbox from, like maybe another device or another system. But IMAP also gives you web-based content, the banner that you see in the email, and then also the prettiness of the email actually came about when IMAP actually was integrated. So when we pull the email for forensic, we often see like kind of like the envelope of your regular postal mail, right? Who sent, who's the recipient, which post office handled that actual piece of mail. So in the forensic perspective, when you look at the content, you might not be able to retrieve everything for that particular email, but at least the header of the email, which shows you who sent and who's the recipient and which servers handle the email. IMAP is also incorporated for attachment purposes. So you would see that if the email has an attachment. So if you do malware forensic, if it comes through like for ransomware, if it comes through an email, right, you would then refer back to how it was transferred using the email header and looking at the protocols that was used for the service. So POP3 and SMTP is covered here, right? And it goes in depth on how each of these protocols are used. So it says that beware that the email conducting that you're looking at in forensic, it may be only be a copy, right? The user has the option to leave the copy of the email in the server. So once the email has been downloaded, the system can remove it from the server to reduce storage. So sometimes the user can actually delete the and we do this, right? But when you delete email, it doesn't necessarily purge that from the server. You have to really empty your delete folder. In some cases, when you click delete and empty your delete folder, eventually it will update that on the actual server. It has to synchronize. And in that sense, right, you would see that it's gonna delete that on from the server. So this is kind of like what you would see. You're gonna see a lot of different servers in between, sometime many, sometime a few. Not only one, even if it's for the same company. So let's say that you are using RCCD email as a student, right? You would see that there are multiple servers handling it. Only because we want to have redundancy in the technical area. And also sometimes in the webmail purposes, they are using like additional servers that is external. So what you see is not all the servers might belong to that particular service provider. And then it talks about IMAP. Okay. So for number 5, it says in a web-based email, what happens when the user deletes an email? So the email typically remains on the server until the system deletes the item. Now, know that even when the server deletes it, because those servers get backed up, right? Sometimes the service provider, they can actually pull the prior backup. So if it was backed up the previous day where that email wasn't deleted, they might be able to pull that for you. So, if you see that you have to find an email that was deleted locally and on the actual server, what you can do is you can also ask the service provider to give you access to maybe a prior backup of the email. Sometimes they'll be able to pull that, but you must wait because it's not always instant that they will be able to give you that information. Okay, so we are going to talk about message ID and email ID. So here's your web-based email. And then here is your email header. So before we talk about the next question, you need to kind of look at the example here. Because when you do forensic today, you're going to see something like this. Email header is not exactly cleanly looking. It has a lot of content in text. This screenshot actually gives you, some decent information where it shows you like the servers that handles it and the IP address in between. Think of it like if I send a greeting card from California to New York, right? It has to go through many post office, and it's the same thing. You would pass it through multiple servers, and so we're gonna do this case today with Gene, and then we're gonna see. But you're always gonna have a timestamp, right? When that email was actually sent, and then it also have timestamp on the servers that are receiving it, and then when it was received. So the email header would look something like this. Now you would have a message ID, and it would have a series of numbers and letters, and that's in hexadecimal usually, right? And then you would have like the domain that it's being integrated or passed through or sent. So message ID is simply an identification for the email that's being sent. It is a way for the system to tag that particular message. So that way it doesn't have conflicts in messages. So if I send a message a minute ago, it would have different ID compared to the current message, right? And so it really is designed for the server to be able to track the messages, because you might have users that sends out massive number of email, and with like spams and other things, right? But then, so it says that globally it is unique, so there should not be any other ID that's matching it because it is unique to that particular message. Like I said, right, even if it's a second apart, it should have two different ID. It cannot be the same ID. So now if you have the same ID, then maybe something is misconfigured or something is not compliant with that email server, or if the user had specifically modified that message, right, to match the same ID, to duplicate that same message. Okay, so for number 6, we can say that the purpose, right, is that it is a unique identification for every email that has been sent. It indicates that there's no other email that has the same ID unless the user has modified the actual ID. Your timestamp, your date and time when that email is created is on the server. So the server tracks it based on, it basically logs, right? It records that particular message when that message was created. And so you can see the server information. So it says, why is it important in digital investigation? Is because it really tells you that that message is unique, right? Or otherwise modified by the user. What type of information can you obtain from the message ID? You can obtain server information. Any question? Okay. Hi. Okay, so you can find the information on page 3. The example that we would see, right? Like I say, that it would be a series of number or letters. And then the @ symbol really indicate your domain information, like google.com, right? xyzmailserver.com, etc. So you would see, and then you would have the timestamp. So it would have date and the time to the seconds. Okay. So on the you when you look at the email header, it's gonna break it down to like received, right? So that's when it actually get to the destination side, and you would see there's the server that's received, right? And then you would have the user ID and the message ID. That's different. So when you create an email account with Yahoo, Google, Live, any of these domains, your account is actually identified as an ID number. The reason why that we would have a username is that it's really for the user, right? I can't remember a 16-digit for the life of me. I can't even remember a 10-digit, right? So, in the actual server, it really identifies the user account with an ID number. And then it would have a message ID, which is what you see subsequently, and the timestamp. And so when you look at it today, trying to see if you can pinpoint those things, and when you write up a report, you have to indicate, right, like John Doe, right, access the email under johndoe@gmail.com with the ID number such as this, right? And then viewing the message with the ID number this, right? So you would be able to put down the information and it talks about that here. And if you want to really correlate the ID number of that account to the user, John Doe, right? You have to ask permission from the service provider to be able to match that up, right? Because it doesn't necessarily, even if you find it in your software, your forensic toolkit, you have to make sure that you verify that with the service provider when you create your report. Okay. Then you also sometime would have IP address information for specific server. This is their public IP, right? And the IP is then be correlated with the server name, hence we have domains, right? DNS is really a way for us to do those things. So, but email server is related to your domain server, ultimately. It has to tie to the account on the domain and then to be able to relate that to the service with the IP addresses. So what you see here is, right, sometimes you would see the version of the type of system that we are working with, okay? And then it talks about IP addresses using IPv4. You might you might see IPv6 in some of the newer servers, but a lot of the time the world still runs on IPv4. So what kind of information can an investigator obtain from the receive line, right, of the email header? So when you look at the email header today, look at the receive line. One, you're going to have the network, the domain name, like companyabc.org. And then your user ID, which is what I mentioned before, that correlates to your user account. Your server names, just keep in mind that there are multiple servers, or they call them transfer agents. So those are like the post office in between that transfer your postal mail, right? And then their correlated IP addresses. So each server would have an IP address. Now, they don't necessarily, some software don't necessarily give you the IP, right? So if you're using a forensic toolkit that doesn't have this information, you can also use Whois or other services to be able to find those systems, right? So ideally, we should see this looking at the receive lines. So when you look at it today, right, when you go to the email text information, it's going to list all the header. And then when you click on it, you can view the majority of the label or the header information. Any question? Okay. I'll take 6 down real quick. Move 8 up a little so it's on one page. Also on your email header, you would find information such as return path. In the case that you would have bounce email or other things, right? What type of information is contained in the return path? If your email has been scanned, which is what you see in the current, right? It will say that sometimes it cannot scan your message, maybe because your message doesn't allow it to scan, but most of your webmail now actually scan for malware when it gets to your mailbox. And you also have a manual option to scan your attachment right before you download it. They implemented this for security reasons, It also, there's a way that we can filter spam, or we can scan it for spam, or report it as spam. So these, feature is included in the return path. So if we're looking at the return path, it would be able to give you information about virus scan, right, spam scan, or some information about the server that handles the email. So you have MIME, and MIME extension actually gives us, as I mentioned, how your email was no longer in plain text, right? Back in the day, your message was in email was in plain text. So it allows us to encode the email so that way it is and the attachments, because the computers that handles it, so everything is still in binary, right? So the extension, your MIME, is allowing you to have your email that accept HTML format. It's able to have body. You can put in emoji. You can add attachment like a JPEG. You can use it like UTF-8 encoding instead of non-ASCII. In the 80s, all the emails were in ASCII text. So there's no way. So people used to use, like in my C++ class, I always see that they submit or Mr. McCree's class, how they would do like little stars to make little boxes, right? So back in the day, that's how you can make your email pretty, is to use symbols to represent, shapes and pictures and things in your email. But mine gives you a little bit better in how you would be able to add, right, more things to your email. With that, we have to know that, one, it's going to give you attachment information. Okay. Two, it's going to give you encoding information. Three, it's going to tell you the data type that is attaching to that email. So this is why when you open your inbox and you're scrolling through your email, right? If you see a little paper clip and it shows you this is like a Word document or a PDF, that's what mine does, right? So in that, when we look at it from a forensic lens, what we know is that this is going to tell us a little bit more about the content of that email, right? So if we do email forensic for malware purposes, then we might see that, okay, it is an executable file that's coming through as an attachment, right? Or sometime that is embedded into a PDF if they're using steganography or something like that, right? So mine gives you that information about the content. Okay, so how do I go about conducting email investigation for a user, right? Or of a user? What kind of tools do I need? So first, you need to pull the content of the email client into your system. That means that, let's say that I use Outlook, right, basic, on my computer. And through that app, it downloads my mail to my system, my inbox, right? The mail that I view, it has to, because in order to preview the email or for the user to look at the content of the email, it has to temporarily load that somewhere. One, it's going to be in RAM. Two, it might be in a certain directory for that application. Especially when you're looking at Windows, it's going to tie that to the folder that is used by that app, okay, for temporary file information. So that means that if I want to find or do forensic on that user, then I have to obtain their mailbox, right? From Outlook Express. I think Outlook Express is retired by Microsoft now since I think the end of Windows 7 when they kind of transitioned into 10. They push Outlook.com, as you know, right? But you still have the basic Outlook. They got rid of Express. It went back to regular Outlook. And I think they tried to get rid of the mail on Windows, which is still Outlook. But you know, I think it still lives through regular Outlook. But if you're using Thunderbird, and Thunderbird is more popular of an application, you can use it for Windows, but you tend to see more of that on like Linux based or other OSs. So what you would have is you have to access the content of their mailbox in these applications. Okay. Another option here, it says, is to use software, right, that is created for email investigation. So when you use bulk extractor does more than email investigation. It does best in email investigation. It also is very good for social media. I think that they don't keep up with it, you know, like Twitter is now X, right? So if you might have to install the updates. So some software are really good at specific things. And bulk extractor, because it is a toolkit, is going to give you, right, options in how you want to look at the. So if I have an image of an iOS or an Android, I can throw it in there, and then be able to pull up like chat messages, you know, any kind of social media information, like especially if they log into an account to like Instagram, Facebook, or other things, right? Now, if you're working with like a Windows 7 system, know that that's when Express really became popular. So, and just keep in mind that Microsoft keeps everything in app data. So when you install an app, you would have a folder, right, under the Microsoft, and then, you know, under the local, if it's on that system, and your app data. So this is different than a roaming profile that we talked about last time. This is a local profile. So you would go to the user account, find the app data, and then under the local folder, you would find Microsoft. Because it's Outlook, then you would be able to find it. Now, I know that people still use live email, not so popular anymore, but Express, Express is under Outlook, and then if you use like live email, then it's under Windows Live. So they simply are just different folder under the Microsoft folder. Okay. So to locate Outlook and Outlook Express, this is how you would go about the path. And you will be able to find the folder, but in order to look at the content, sometimes you might have elevated privilege to do that. On Windows 7, the default path for live, you see that here. What kind of information can we find when we look at these files? So when you open them up, you're going to see the EML file. And the EML file, you're going to be able to see email address, right? Mailbox sizes, right? And then information about that particular user mailbox. My mailbox sizes is tremendous. I don't like to delete email because I want to always go back and reference it. So, but yeah, so you'll be able to find that information in the EML file. Now on Thunderbird, it is slightly different, right? Thunderbird is provided by Mozilla. And the default path for this, so if you install Thunderbird, some of you might use it. It's on the Windows system. If you install Thunderbird, this is the path. It will be under the user account, under app data. It might show up under roaming. And then Thunderbird, and then it has a profile folder. And in that, you can find account information, mailbox sizes, like what we talked about in the other one, and the protocol which ties to the service that they use for Thunderbird. So these apps, like through one app, as you know, I can have many kind of accounts. Like for example, on my Outlook, I have my personal Outlook account, like from outlook.com. I also have my other email, right? And then my work email. So that might be useful when people are using one app for multiple email account to be able to load, right? And then sometimes people don't, but you will be able to find more information this way through the app. Okay. So for email attachment, I think we touched on that. And then for client-based email analysis, which is the section that we're in, you can start looking at it from page 5. And so for Microsoft Outlook, Microsoft had transitioned Outlook into different things over time. I think that it's also because they have different developer team to work on it, and then just the change was somewhat could be smooth or better, but you would see like these type of files, right? Your OST or your MDB or your PST. So the PST file is actually located on the actual drive, right? And you can find that through the app folder. But if you compare PST to OST, ultimately they contain the same information. So here, OST is basically your email offline. So for example, right, like I'm drafting an email using the app. I'm not connected to internet yet, right? I might save it so it saves it to the actual local app folder. And then when I have internet connection, I would connect to my mailbox, and then I would be able to load the draft and then click send. A lot of people do that, right? So that's OST is for offline, and it is in the same path. So it tells you here that you do not need to have a login access to access this file. You can use it to carve out information. It's actually on the drive. So if you use ProDiscover, Autopsy, or any of the forensic toolkit, when you carve, when you do the analysis on the drive, it will likely be able to carve out that if it is stored in some space, right? So Express was replaced with Live, and I think Live, some people still use it, but now I think they transition everything to regular out. Okay. So when you look at this and you're like, oh my gosh, it's kind of hard to see, right? So on the client email, when you open up the EML file, it looks like this, right? Not necessarily, looking pretty, but it does tell you the hierarchy of different email and its inbox, all right? So for example, like I mentioned, you might have user that use the same app for multiple accounts, like between could be Hotmail, could be, other email account. And within that, each account would have inbox and other things. So you would see that it would have like different calendars and different folders to be able to store the items. And then Thunderbird information is on page 6. And Thunderbird has a little bit different in how you would see, but when you look at the file, right, it does have a similar look because I think they're using the same software for the screen capture. So what you see is it labels a little bit differently. Like you would compare to the last one, you have like inbox and draft. So you do see some IMAP information, and then also logs. So these are like example of your Thunderbird type of folder. So archive is basically archive mail, right? Like I can archive something, store it away, and retrieve it later if I need to. You got draft, so it's always going to be with the extension MSF. And then you have sent or you have trash, which is what we see with delete in other apps. And then MSF stands for mail summary files. This is part of the email. And then you have the inbox file. So two pieces, right? For Thunderbird, you would need to view the inbox file. It doesn't have file extension, but if you want more information about the email itself, then you have to look at the MSF file. And so MSF index the files that contain email headers. So this is going to give you more information because it's a summary of your email. Okay, it will give you the header. And then the format for other email clients that you see with Apple Mail or Opera, right? Similar to be with Thunderbird. So you would see that you can also use, right, Forensic Toolkit to be able to pull that. Okay, so we talk a little bit about different type of application that the user would use for email, and so how you would go about analyzing that. And for 14, it says, what must the investigator do to analyze web mail artifacts? And that's the next section. First, you need to use tools to analyze your temp internet files. That means that will be your internet cache information on the system. A lot of them will be on RAM. We touched on that last week. So your temporary internet files or cache can also be on your folder in your drive, right? It contains images, some text content, or if there's an embedded web page that is viewed through the browser. So like, for example, right, like I might receive an email that would have a link in it and I click it and it opens my browser to be able to load it. So you would see that there, okay? You would see that temporary information that gets loaded, right? Because I had clicked that through my email. So you want to obtain more information on the client webmail, you should look at your internet temporary folder. Any question? We're almost done. So I'll take this to the next section so we can see. Okay, so for 15, it asks you, what should an investigator do to gather artifacts from Gmail? So if you have to investigate an account that is using Gmail, again, because it is a web-based email, right? You need to look at your internet cache and also doing RAM analysis, looking at page file. That is stored on your solid state or your hard drive, okay? We would use keyword search, and you're gonna see some of that today with Bulk Extractor. You can search based on email addresses that you are investigating, or any kind of term that will be related to your case, or you know, the actual email itself. So you can start with like the username or the email address, and then if you want to look into, you can also search for like company's name and so on, right? So we can build out our keyword search list and be able to implement that for the investigation. And this would also go for other type of webmail as well. Okay. So now let's talk about browser. Now, and the reason why is that usually people access their email via the browser, right? They don't necessarily use the actual install app. I do that all the time too. Like for my Gmail, I just use Chrome. Most of you do, right? So, to find the information, simply look into browsing history. Okay. So for Chrome, the default path for this is going to be this Windows PC, okay? Under the user account app data, and then because it's Chrome is installed locally, you would see the package for, or the folder for the package for Chrome and Google. And then user data, and it will be under default. Now, if you want the history of the email, then you actually have to go one deeper. So you need to go to history provider cache. Then you have to get into the Gmail section, which is the subfolder here. So ultimately, when we look at like how is this different than the actual email app, you just have to go to the browser app and folder. And then if it has a subfolder for specific email, right, access, then you would go to the history provider. Now, if they choose to use Firefox, right, you can find it in local under Mozilla Firefox, and Firefox store things as profile and cache directory. So you can find that there. And it would store internet history, like the web pages that they viewed, the cache underneath for the user profile. So case scenario, right? Like let's say that I'm investigating an employee that commits fraud, and the way that they circulate the information about the financial account is through their personal email on the work computer, right? And so I have to dive in and look at, right, if they're using the browser, and on the browser, if they're using their email account. When does that happen, right? When did they click and access their email through the browser? Because most people don't have privilege to install that email app, right? Or they don't link it to their regular Outlook. And in the case that if they delete that, right? Remember what I said, right? When you delete things, they don't necessarily go away. So you might have to dig a little deeper with RAM and then see if there are additional information. So this is what we see with Firefox. And I think we also have another chapter that focuses more on like browsers. But this is crucial. And with the internet history, we can also see things that they search for that could be relevant to outside of the email forensic, right? You know that service provider keep your data and store your data, right? Everything that you search for, everything that you access, they have information on, because this is how they cater marketing to the world these days. So with that, the best approach, right, to really get more specific information is to get the information from service provider. So they would be able to give you access or even a file that contains everything about that particular full user mailbox. And then you just load that as an image to, or like an email file to be able to read. Now, some company, I know of some small company that instead of having their own email server, they would acquire the service from Google or Microsoft to be able to host their company's email, right? Like they would be using like a Gmail domain, but it's actually to their company directory and then subdivided into the user account. So you do see some of that. Any question? So our goal today when we're working on the lab is to, right, ultimately answer the case questions. But throughout, right, you want to be able to apply concept, like by looking at things like I mentioned, user ID information, message ID information, because that's what you need to document ultimately on the report if you submit that, right? I don't require that as part of the lab, but for future projects or things that you work on. And then when you're looking at email headers, look at like the server information, their IP addresses. Uh, and then ask yourself, right, does this email address look legitimate? Right? Can someone impersonate the individual to send the email? Because when a user create the email, it might look a certain way, right? Or they're given a company's email, and then if someone else trying to impersonate them, it might look like the real email, but when you look at it, does it look exactly the same, right? And you see this part of it, when people are sending phishing scam, right? They might impersonate something that is legitimate, looks close to the real thing, but not exactly. So tomorrow they have that cybersecurity summit in the city of Fontana. I think I posted that for your extra credit. It's from 11 to 1 p.m. If you want to attend, that's hosted by Zeta Sky. Usually they have a fun food. And you can bring food there. I've seen people bring their children, but you can come in. It's like they have these round table where you can sit. A lot of the companies people will be there. I think FBI will present. I don't know if they're inviting other companies to do some demo. Last time they did. So it's kind of good to go and see hear and see what's going on and then network with people. Introduce yourself, ask questions. Hi. So, and then you have two other extra credit opportunity that I have posted under the same module. One is my ISACA. It is a virtual event, so if you're planning to get ISACA certification, if you want to be an IT auditor, you can be an external auditor and be on the roster, so any company can hire you. You know how you have traveling nurses, that's kind of like that. So you can be on the roster, so you can still do what you do, but you can still have an additional contract to do that. So they bring in external auditor to be able to check the system security and so on. But we have a CIS-8 course that I am going to try to offer for those of you who are trying to finish the certificate. We try to run it this semester, but it wasn't filled. So we're gonna try to do it again, and I can't offer it online yet until the online record gets in, and I haven't been able to work on it. But it was written by another faculty and it needs to be corrected. Something needs to be updated and fixed. It's 54 lecture hours, which now, the state, they require that to be changed. And there's no lab component, so I'm gonna modify that with some lab component. But we will try to run it before, because when we send things, curriculum through for approval, it usually take a year and a half plus. Just crazy. But anyway. Any question regarding the lecture for today? And then I forgot to mention that they have an expo for apprenticeship. that's coming up in November, and I posted the date. So if you are in the program, or if you're interested in the program, you want to get into the program, I can show you how you can do the orientation in December, and then you can attend that too. There's employers there, and you can go and talk to them. It's basically a not just for IT, it's actually for all the other apprentices and apprenticeship too. Okay. So look through the notes. It's important to kind of read a little bit more on like Gmail, what it looks like. So, you know, you're gonna see today, right? When you look at email headers, it's lots of information in a small space. So we are gonna have to kind of dissect it and look at it a little bit, kind of like the screenshot. So that's what you see. But you see, right, like SMTP sometime. So in this class, the chapters are somewhat pretty short, right? The notes are generally pretty brief. So when 8 pages is not compared to CIS-40A, you guys know, right? It's usually like 20 pages or 15 at least. So, but you know, it's kind of good to look through and be familiar with the information. Okay, let me stop recording. Are we okay with the questions? Do we need any to look over any of these? All right.